The Scenic City, the River City, the Gateway to the South, the Dynamo of Dixie, Gig City. Chattanooga has earned a lot of nicknames over the years. Some we still hear, some have faded with time. Another one of those nicknames, the birthplace of the Medal of Honor. That story started back in 1863 and new chapters are still being written today. The Chattanooga National Cemetery has profound meaning for people here in this city, but it doesn't stop there.
A stunningly important national historical place in the United States of America for a lot of reasons.
After Philip Shadrach and George Wilson of the legendary Andrews Raiders were awarded the Medal of Honor last week, there are now 11 Medal of Honor recipients buried here at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. The first were 4 Andrews Raiders who were moved from Atlanta and reburied here in 1866, just after the Civil War. William Zion, a Marine awarded the medal for actions in the Boxer Rebellion, was in charge of a German POW barracks in Fort Oglethorpe during World War I and accidentally shot himself while cleaning his gun. World War II recipients Desmond Doss and Charles Coolidge are buried here. Ray Duke fought in the Korean War. And over the last year, Vietnam veteran Larry Taylor, and now Shadrach and Wilson.
This is not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be hard because of the extreme dignity of the Medal of Honor and those men and Mary Walker that have been awarded the Medal of Honor.
Last week, Chattanooga made a trip to Washington, D.C.
Steal a Confederate train near Atlanta and drive it north to Chattanooga, just over the Georgia border.
To the White House,
which Union troops were preparing to capture. That is Chattanooga.
The Pentagon.
Just 18 miles from Chattanooga, the Raiders were forced to abandon the train and disperse into the woods.
The Shadrach and Wilson story will always be part of Tennessee and Georgia history, but we share that history with counties in western Pennsylvania, towns across Ohio, and the entire country. The legacy of the Medal of Honor may have been born here, but these medals have been earned around the globe and are symbols of the price so many have paid for the freedoms we all enjoy.
Their story doesn't just inspire us, it challenges us. So we are not just here to honor their sacrifice, we are here to live up to their example.
Shadrach and Wilson will now have new gravestones added to their final resting place at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. Those new markers will say Medal of Honor written in gold. A dedication being planned for the fall. As soon as those details are finalized, we will let you know. Josh Rowe, Fox, Chattanooga. Today on the show, 2 Civil War soldiers, 2 members of Andrews Raiders, George Wilson and Philip Shadrach, were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor at the White House on July 3rd. In this episode, a conversation with a descendant of the Philip Shadrach family, Jennifer Sweet. This conversation was recorded earlier this year when it was unclear when or even if these heroes would be honored. My name is Josh Rowe. And this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee.
This whole process, I think, for you guys and everybody involved has been getting your hopes up and being let down and getting your hopes up and being let down. So can you just kind of describe and explain kind of that period?
Yeah. So, after I did the research in the 90s and I had all this interest, and I think even I have a letter from the governor of Ohio saying, as soon as I get it confirmed, to let them know because they want to honor him, and that was probably 96, 97. And ever since then, in the early 2000s, I had reached out, had heard something, they were going to get it taken care of. But yeah, I just kind of lost faith that anyone would do anything. Because the whole narrative is that it's not his real name. He used a fake name, so there's no way to prove who he says he is and that you're related to him. And to me, it's like, I don't care about getting the medal for myself. It's about getting it for him so that he's honored for his sacrifice.
Many members of the Shadrach family have been told through the years that one factor in how long it's taken to get Shadrach awarded the Medal of Honor is confusion and issues over his name. At times you can find his name as Philip. Other times you can find Perry. It appears he went by both of those names, but he enlisted as Charles Shadrach. In recent years, another Shadrach family descendant told me he learned from government officials that his name really was not a factor. That would also not explain why this process has taken so long for the family of George Wilson. Also, the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act, signed into law by President George W. Bush, approved a request by Congress to have Shadrach and Wilson awarded the Medal of Honor, but it's taken until now to make that happen.
It's just sad that since Bush approved it back in 2008, the generation before me is gone. My dad and his brother that talked about what he did for his country. Dad passed in 2016, and Uncle Bill, the one who fought in World War II, passed away at the age of 95 in 2019. So 11 years, something could have been done. Yeah, I just don't have any faith in bureaucracy. I have absolutely no faith that they'll take care of it.
Man, I know that's disappointing to know how many generations your family have known this story and have known that he wasn't honored. That I can understand why that's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with all that, tell me, just we got off to an emotional start already. It's all good though. So walk me back a little bit. When do you remember hearing? Let's even go before that. You mentioned the different names, right? So
yeah,
Perry Shadrach is what we hear the most. We also Philip Shadrach is what we see. Like I think his grave marker says PG Shadrach. I've seen different spellings. There's been an H and a K at the end.
Charles Philip Shadrach.
Right. And so can you, through your research, explain what you can about that, just different names and different times and what's and such?
Right. So just in reading William Pittenger's book, he was one of the survivors, and him writing about him, he stated that, I believe it was in his book, that he stated that Perry changed his name because his brother would call him Flip for Philip. I can't remember, but it was because he's being made fun of by his siblings that he changed his name. So like I said, this is my grandma's great uncle, and she passed when my dad was only 19 years old. So a lot of the stories that we know have been passed down. I mean, but that was the big thing, was that he didn't like the nicknames that people gave him, so he changed his name.
And so you said that his brother would give him grief and whatnot, but so they were orphans. Explain kind of what happened to their parents and kind of how the children ended up where they were, et cetera.
Yeah. So, and this is stuff that I've learned, some of this stuff from Ron, because so Perry's parents were Robert and Elizabeth, and their children were born like in 1828. My grandmother was born in 1834. Then Perry was born in 1840, and then the youngest sister, and there's another brother in there, Oliver, and I can't remember where he falls in the group, but it's the oldest son, and I can't think of his name right now, and then Susan, and then Perry, Oliver, and Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth was born in 1843, her mother died shortly afterwards. So when the mother died, and this is very typical of the time period, because they're from Westmoreland County outside of Pittsburgh. The kids were broken up and sent to other families to live because the father couldn't take care of all the kids. So like I found Susan living with the Marks family, and she ended up marrying one of their sons. And then when she married one of the Markses, her younger sister Elizabeth was living with her in 1860. So it's just that's what you had to do. You did that to survive. It's like the father, there wasn't any subsistence or, assistance from the government. You just found a way to make things happen, and family members stepped up and took the kids.
Yeah. And at the time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, because in Ohio, I've done research back to the 1700s in Ohio, but in Pennsylvania, they don't have centralized locations for information on birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. It's very, very, very difficult because I went there in 96 for 3 weeks. I had a heck of a time finding anything. So it's just, yeah.
So were the children born in Pennsylvania and then moved to Ohio later? Is that what happened?
Right. So like my 2 times great grandparents, Susan Shadrach Marks, who is she's the older sister. In the 1850 census, she was living in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. And in the 1860 census, she was living in Ohio with her husband.
Gotcha. And
yeah. And there's like literally, Pittsburgh is only like an hour and a half from here, from where I live. So, yeah.
Yeah. Understood. So tell me what age you were when you first started hearing these stories about the locomotive chase and Perry Shadrach and these things.
Ever since I can remember. I was probably only 4 or 5. My dad was a huge history buff, and we always went to museums and historical sites all over Ohio. That's what we did as kids, between camping and going to historical sites. So I've known about Perry since I can remember. And one of Uncle Bill's children has the high chair that Perry built.
And that's interesting talking to Ron, because his family didn't talk about it. He didn't know the story until he was, I think, late teens, early adulthood, because the family kind of looked at it like, we don't want to talk about that because there's some questions we have answers to, et cetera.
Right. And for Ron, it was different. So from what I've been able to tell from doing the family trees, is that Ron and Colin are distant cousins to Perry, whereas I am a niece. So it was through Perry's father, his siblings, that they're related. They're the descendants of Perry's father. So yeah, very, very distant cousins, whereas I'm the closest living relative, basically, which was really weird to think about.
So that's important, I think, right? Because like you said, typically with the Pentagon and the Medal of Honor, they're going to contact the closest family members. I think Ron's taking up the mantle in a lot of ways of the research and kind of being out front on this.
Right.
But that said, Pentagon's not talked to him. I talked to a woman named Ashley Wilson on the phone the other day, who's Fort Wilson's family. They haven't heard anything directly from anyone. It's kind of like through, like I said, the congressman, the General Bell, Brad Quinlan, the historian. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just kind of like being discussed around people who know people who know people, but there's been direct contact between the Pentagon and the families. And any thoughts on that? Kind of like what
Ron and I actually talked about this, and to us, it's more important that it's actually honored. It doesn't matter who holds it. And actually, we discussed having because I've got a niece and a nephew who are both very interested in family history. And it's more important to keep it especially the museum for the Great Train Robbery that's up in Northwest Ohio, keeping it somewhere like that rather than people fighting over it, because it's not ours, it's his.
If and when and all the stuff does happen, I know that. So there's a Medal of Honor Heritage Center here in Chattanooga, and they've been front and center on a lot of these things. And I know they're going to have if it does happen, we expect it to happen. Don't know the details, but I know they're planning, events around it and are obviously going to celebrate it, because when you first walk into the Heritage Center, the first exhibit is Andrews Raiders, and
Right, because it was the first one.
First ones, and it was the chase ended in Ringgold, Georgia, which is about 20 miles outside, not even that, probably 10 miles outside of Chattanooga City, and so there's so many ties to this here. What are your thoughts on that specifically? That like Chattanooga?
I would love to come to Chattanooga to see this, because, like I said, Dad was such a history buff, and we were raised to understand and know our history and to honor the people that have sacrificed. And I would love to come to Chattanooga to put flowers on his grave, if nothing else.
Stories been in history books have been told, a Disney movie and documentaries,
right?
And, books, and so this story's been around for a very, very long time. All the survivors wrote books. This is not, it's buried history in some ways, because you had to do a lot of work to figure some things out. But in some ways, the story is very well known.
Well, yeah. So what pushed me to do it? It was 93. I was like 26 years old. My dad was 65. And his oldest sister was 81, 82 years old. And I'm like, on my mom's side of the family, I'm friends with my second cousins. My mom's first cousin's kids and their kids, I'm friends with them. I've known them all my life. On my dad's side, I've only known him and his siblings and their kids. Now, granted, that's like a million people, but I never knew anything about his mother's side or his dad's side. I knew about a little bit, but I was like, because of their age, I wanted to know more about Perry and exactly how he was related. And then my dad's great grandmother or grandmother that was born in Ireland, because no one knew anything about her either. So that's really what started this. It's like, okay, I've heard about Uncle Perry all my life. How is he related to us?
I think it's interesting, all these years later, how both families are really learning this story in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think, because I told you about how my grandmother, she was an orphan. Her father and mother died. By the time she was 11, both of her parents and 3 of her siblings had died. And so obviously she had to have told my dad and his siblings about this, but she probably wasn't quite sure. And yeah, so.
What would it mean to you personally, if this does come to fruition? What would that mean to you?
Well, just the simple fact that he'd finally get honored for his sacrifice. That's what it all comes down to. And I've already so I told you I'm one of 30 grandchildren. Now we've lost quite a few, because they were like, my oldest one would be 95 this year. And I've told some of my cousins that are in their 70s and 80s, they're like, really? This might actually happen? So, yeah. It'd be huge, because my cousin, like I said, I have lots of cousins that were in the military. Like my cousin Chuck, he's 87 years old. He was a Marine in the 50s. He was based in Honolulu. He still acts like a Marine. And I read your background. You got that Marine background too. So, yeah, it would be amazing. It would be amazing. And I've got my brother-in-law is ex-Navy. I've got a nephew and a great nephew who are both in the military. Actually, a nephew-in-law, I should say, and a great nephew that are both in the military right now serving. So it would be amazing.
Yeah, I think for that older generation who's still around,
yeah,
to finally see this happen while they're still, with us would be pretty
right. It would be, yeah, yep.
Yeah. You said in your email about him being an orphan and didn't have a spouse, wasn't married, and knowing the history of all the Raiders and how they were awarded, right? Some they were spread out. There were some that were awarded pretty soon after. Jacob Parrott was the first one, but it took several years for many of them. There was nobody to really fight for Davenport and for Wilson and Shadrach.
Yeah.
and I think that's probably part of this narrative, right? There wasn't anyone
Yes.
at the mantle and making this an issue. And your thoughts
Well,
on
Ron did his research, and I wasn't even aware of this. Ron found those letters from Perry's younger sister, Elizabeth, who fought to get his back pay. And the fact that she was fighting for it, it's like, wow. But they still wouldn't. I mean, just to honor the man, Mike, how difficult is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a story. So I've been working with the Heritage Center, 2017, maybe something like that. And I say working with, I MC their annual luncheon and do stories with them, and they're awesome people. But I'd heard the story before then, but that was when I really started hearing the story a lot. But when the story is told, and when you go and look it up, you hear the story of the event. What is equally, if not more fascinating, is them being on the run, them being captured, the time they were in jail, the court martial, how 8 were executed and the rest were not. I mean, and then the battle to get the medals of honor for the ones who did get it. I mean, there's a lot to this story that is kind of under the surface a little bit. That you realize the way they were treated after the fact is in a lot of ways as honorable, if not more honorable, of being a prisoner of war and being mistreated and all that. I mean, there's a lot to this story that people probably don't even know the depths of.
Oh, that it was so sad when I read, because Ron shared the link to his website, and I read about the one raider who committed suicide in 1866 or 1868 because of PTSD, the torture that they went through. Yeah.
There's a historical marker. It's not there anymore, but the jail where they were held here, and it was basically like just a dirty dungeon, and they're just all packed in there together. And you read it, and you're like, who in the world, would want to be in that situation? You wouldn't. But then on top of that, just trying to, and then when Andrews escaped and he ran down the river, and just the condition he was in. I mean, it's just these men. Knew they were doing something that was probable that they could be,
right,
look for, but at the same time, which was just heroic, in itself. But at the same time, that what they endured in the days and weeks after that, it's pretty wild part of the story.
Yeah.
I'm gonna read you one thing. When I talked to Ron about this, and he got pretty emotional about it. He brought it up. He brought it up. I didn't, but and it makes me want to get your thoughts on it. I can find it. I had it pulled up earlier. This is from the book "Stealing the General," written by Russell S. Bonds, and it's a great book. It's fascinating, but there's part of this that it's hard for Ron, and I'm sure it's hard for your family. And it's basically the story of why Shadrach maybe wasn't honored. So here it is. But the names of the other 4 men would never be listed on the roll of Medal of Honor recipients. James Andrews, William Campbell, both being civilians, were simply not eligible for the award. George Wilson and Perry Shadrach, for whatever reason, would never receive the Medal of Honor. And in fact, it appears that they were never seriously considered. Perhaps it was that no one ever requested the medal on their behalf. Indeed, or Shadrach was treated just the opposite. Back home in Steubenville, Ohio, the fallen private's name was omitted from being inscribed on a courthouse square monument to the town's war dead. Apparently, some folks figured he did not deserve to be there, listed among the fallen blue uniformed heroes. After all, Shadrach had been hanged as a spy. No honor in that.
Right.
And what Ron said was, number one, it's hard to say that Steubenville was his hometown because he didn't really have a hometown.
No.
But he said that some of that talk around the spy and all that may have been why part of his family didn't really want to talk about it, because there were things that they really couldn't explain, answer to, you know, those kind of things. But so
Right.
when you hear that passage, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not surprising. It's because knowing that both of his parents were dead and knowing the era and knowing that, yeah, there wasn't any family in Steubenville because they weren't from Steubenville. They were from Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and eventually immigrated to Ohio. So, in Northern Ohio. So like his sister, Susan, my great-great-grandmother, they settled in Creston, Ohio, which is half an hour south of here. So it's more Northeast Ohio is where they settled. Steubenville is definitely southern. And where Steubenville is located, right there with West Virginia, right there in the corner, you had a lot of people that were sympathetic to the South along the Ohio River. I lived in Cincinnati for a while, and you could see it. There was sympathy towards the South because it was like right on the edge. Whereas Northern Ohio was settled mostly by abolitionists, not Southern Ohio. Southern Ohio, the people came directly across from Virginia. So you have more Southern sympathizers along that area. Steubenville, it may have just been a crossing point because I believe it said that he signed up in Mineral City, Ohio. I don't even know where Mineral City is. I have not bothered to look on a map to see where that's at. And also that he was in Louisville, Ohio, which is not far from where I live now. That's actually where he was working before he signed up. But who knows? He could have been going from farm to farm to farm, just working as a laborer. I have no clue because that kind of detail between 1850 to 1860, I mean, that's going to be so hard to find.
Right. I mean, and you would assume there are no records. Like you said, if he's working as a laborer on a farm or something, there's no records of
right.
that. You know?
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. There's no W-2 back then.
No.
no
LinkedIn.
That didn't exist. So yeah, how do you know?
So I did find Gebhard Shadrach at the age of 4 living with a family in Pennsylvania on a census record.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
And so his life,
those are more telling than anything else.
So his life as an orphan, was he in an orphanage or was he jumping from family to family?
Family to family. That's what you did. Mm-hmm. Especially in if you're in a city like New York City, you went to an orphanage. But if you were out in the rural land, typically neighbors took kids. Family members took kids. Yeah.
Hard way to grow up for sure. I can only imagine.
Yeah, because I know, like my grandma's sweet. She was raised by her mom's sister. So that's what you did. You just took care of the kids.
A big thank you to Jennifer Sweet for this conversation on Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.